speak out for those magnificent children, isn't it? Weren't they magnificent? They got it right. Human rights, non-discrimination, and the important thing, to choose their lunch. I like to choose my lunch too. I'm going to read my paper because you have it translated into Korean. So for the translators, you can use the paper I'm going to read it. If someone could let me know 5 minutes before the end, because the paper's a bit long and I might leave you to read the rest. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and children. It is indeed a great honour for me to speak at this International Child Rights Forum at Sungkyunkwan University in Seoul, Korea. In particular, may I warmly thank Professor Yang Hee Lee and her colleagues for organising this superb seminar. Professor Yang Hee Lee came to know my wife and I when Yang Hee and I were chairpersons, respectively, of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Children, which I shall call the CRC Committee, and of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I shall call the CRPD Committee. I've learned so much from Professor Lee, and this makes it an added pleasure to speak here today. In this presentation, I will examine the human rights of children with disabilities in the 3 following segments. First, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which I shall call the CRPD, does enshrine the human rights of children with disabilities. The unpacking of its relevant articles will illustrate its protective features. Second, the work of the CRPD Committee, which is the monitoring body of the CRPD, is instructive. The CRPD Committee has been concerned about children with disabilities in all of its constructive dialogues. Finally, if time permits, it's appropriate for me to say a few words about the high-level meeting on disability and development, which I shall call the HLMDD, which took place at the United Nations headquarters in New York on 23 September this year. Most certainly, the outcome document from the HLMDD will lead to a new post-15 framework. If I don't get time to say much about the high-level meeting, you can read it in the papers. It's the first 2 sections that really concern me. The next section, the CRPD and children with disabilities. There are 10 human rights treaties, and it is essential to appreciate that they build upon one another chronologically. The CRPD is the second most recent convention, with the Convention on Enforced Disappearances being the youngest of the 10. Accordingly, in this International Child Rights Forum, it's important to place on record the enormous debt which the CRPD owes to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I shall call the CRC. Prior to the CRPD, the CRC was the only treaty to include a stand-alone article on the rights of children with disabilities, Article 23, and indeed the first treaty to contain a specific reference to disabilities. The CRC makes it very clear that children's vulnerability is not to be equated with worthlessness, and that children have equal value irrespective of their circumstances. It's clear that the drafters of the CRC and the CRC committee were ahead of their time in mainstreaming disability as a human rights issue, reflecting the importance and innovation of Article 23, the CRC committee gave particular attention to the situation of children with disabilities in some of its early general comments, including its 2006 general comment on the rights of children with disabilities. From 2002 to 2006, the CRPD was being negotiated not simply by governments, but also by civil society. The work of the CRC committee was ever present during these discussions, which led to the CRPD being passed on the voices by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 13th of December 2006, and the CRPD actually came into force on the 3rd May 2008, which is the wedding anniversary of Professor Cochrane and myself, which is interesting. Now, I've written in my paper that by October 2013, can I say now, by November 2013, 137, not 134, we've had 3 more, the last being Venezuela, 137 states parties and the European Union have ratified the CRPD. These figures make it not the most ratified, but the fastest ratified convention amongst all of the United Nations human rights treaties. In my view, this is because there is general recognition that persons with disabilities, and more especially children with disabilities, need their human rights to be protected by an international treaty. What is distinctive about the CRPD is that it fulfills its basic protective function whilst proposing a significant paradigm shift. Rather than approaching people with disabilities from a benevolent welfare mindset, it places their human rights, their agency and their dignity front and centre. Its purpose, set out in the first sentence of Article 1, is, quote, to promote, protect and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their, can I say our, inherent dignity. The CRPD does not set out to create new rights for people with disabilities. Instead, it articulates and asserts the application of earlier human rights instruments to people with disabilities, and provides a conceptual and practical framework for ensuring those rights. Article 3 of the CRPD sets out 8 principles which underpin the CRPD. Briefly put, these principles require governments, persons and bodies to treat all persons with disabilities with respect because of their inherent dignity, and to ensure that their disabilities do not restrict their full participation in society. The form of these general principles are unique to the CRPD. No other human rights treaty sets out its founding and unifying principles so clearly. The general principles make it very clear that the spirit of the CRPD requires states parties not to treat people with disabilities as the objects of charity, but instead to recognise them as citizens, as subjects and rights holders who are equally deserving of their place in the community. This applies equally to children with disabilities as it does to adults with disabilities. Two concepts are central to the working of the entire CRPD. The first, and it's one that the children here mentioned in their statement, non-discrimination. See, the children have got it right. Article 5 of the CRPD is its linchpin provision. It prohibits discrimination against persons with disabilities. Discrimination is defined as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction on the basis of disabilities which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. Goodness me. The very concept of discrimination is tied to and measured against a benchmark of full enjoyment of human rights on an equal basis with other persons. Crucially, discrimination expressly includes reasonable accommodation. Reasonable accommodation is the second foundation concept of the CRPD. It's defined as necessary and appropriate modification and adjustment, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden where needed in a particular case to ensure to persons with disabilities the enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. In short, reasonable accommodation is that which is necessary to ensure that persons with disabilities are on a level playing field when compared with other persons. Thus, the CRPD provides new ways of approaching and redressing discrimination, of redressing disadvantage. If a person's vulnerabilities are conceptualised as the result of their vulnerabilities not being accommodated, it is much clearer that the onus is on the person or body excluding them to address that exclusion, so long as it is reasonable to do so. On this approach, a harm such as confinement to institutions and exclusion of children with disabilities from mainstream education can be addressed not only as a direct violation of a substantive right, such as Article 24 that Dr. DeFranco will speak about later on, but also as an example of prohibited discrimination and a lack of reasonable accommodation. The CRPD covers all people with disabilities, but it's especially protective of children with disabilities. They have their own specific article, Article 7, but it is important to stress that their rights are embedded across the breadth of the CRPD. The word children is mentioned 24 times in the English version of the CRPD, and the word child is mentioned 12 times. Girls and boys with disabilities are mentioned another 6 times. It's right throughout the CRPD. The prominence of children with disabilities begins with paragraph R of the preamble to the CRPD, which recognises the importance of the CRC and the importance of the obligations that states parties to that treaty have undertaken. It recognises that children with disabilities should have full enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with other children, and recalls obligations to that end undertaken by states parties to the CRC. You've really got to see the CRC and the CRPD together when dealing with children with disabilities. They're integrated together. This paragraph demonstrates the close alignment of the two treaties, each of which is premised on the recognition that children with disabilities are entitled to enjoy human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with all other children. The general principles in Article 3, that's of the CRPD, contain a general principle on children with disabilities. Article 3, Principle H, requires states parties to have, quote, respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities and respect for the right of children with disabilities to preserve their identity, unquote. It too has close synergy with the CRC. The language of evolving capacities comes directly from the CRC Article 5 and Article 14.2. The concept of the best interests of the child, which Professor Mary Crocker will talk about later, is perhaps the most important concept adopted. This is the most important. Let me read that again. The concept of the best interest of the child is perhaps the most important concept in the CRC, and the CRPD has adopted it in Article 7, its specific children's provision. Article 7, paragraph 2, promises children with disabilities the enjoyment of rights on an equal basis with other children by demanding that their best interests are a priority consideration in all decisions concerning them. This article does not create in signatory states any greater obligation than under the CRC, which at any rate is more widely ratified. The best interest standard is also found in Article 23 of the CRPD. Article 23 is concerned with respect for family life, and it requires that states parties shall ensure that a child shall not be separated from his or her parents against their will, except when competent authorities, subject to judicial review, determine in accordance with applicable laws and procedures that such separation is necessary for the best interests of the child. In its 2006 general comment on the rights of children with disabilities, the CRC committee noted that children with disabilities are disproportionately vulnerable to non-registration at birth, and that non-registration in turn increases the risk of neglect, institutionalisation, and even death. Article 18 of the CRPD covers liberty of movement and nationality. Paragraph 2 of this article, that's Article 18, expressly concerns itself with children with disabilities. It states, children with disabilities shall be registered immediately after birth and shall have the right from birth of a name, the right to acquire a nationality, and as far as possible, the right to know and be cared for by their parents. The CRC Committee's concerns about birth registration has been shared by the members of the CRPD Committee. Although this matter has not yet directly arisen in any of our constructive 10 first dialogues so far, I can assure you that we are very concerned from our own life experiences about the need for registration of birth. The CRPD Committee, let me go on to the next section, which is the work of the CRPD Committee. The CRPD Committee mirrors the other human rights treaty monitoring bodies in structure and function. Article 34 of the CRPD establishes a committee of 18 experts charged with monitoring the implementation of the CRPD in member states. It comprises 18 members who are elected by the state's parties. Members can only be re-elected once. I've been re-elected once, that's it. Which means that members may only serve 2 4-year terms. This means that the CRPD Committee's membership will renew itself and that the CRPD Committee will not be in danger of stagnation. Article 36, paragraph 1 of the CRPD gives power to the CRPD Committee to examine reports which Article 34 requires states parties to submit first 2 years after ratification and subsequently every 4 years, and to make such suggestions and general recommendations on the report as it may consider appropriate, and shall forward these to the state party concerned. The manner in which the CRPD Committee examines these reports, which culminates in a constructive dialogue with the reporting country, is much the same as is the examination of state party reports by the other United Nations treaty bodies. And we've modelled ourselves on the way the CRC does its constructive dialogues. We really owe a great deal to the CRC. Its members read the report from the country and also alternative reports which are usually made by civil society and disabled persons organisations. What is unique about the CRPD Committee is its composition. It is made up almost entirely of persons who have disabilities. 17 of the current 18 members have disabilities such as blindness, difficulty with mobility, loss of limbs, and psychosocial disabilities. There is no parallel amongst the other treaty bodies of a monitoring body whose members are both independent experts and uniquely rights holders owing to their disabilities. Certainly, the delegates of bodies like the Human Rights Council and the Committee Against Torture are themselves rights holders, but there is no parallel to the way that the CRPD Committee models as well as promotes inclusion and reasonable accommodation. The CRPD Committee, by its very presence, as well as its work, challenges the stereotypes and social barriers described in Article 8 of the CRPD. No doubt, for some governments, no doubt to some government officials, particularly from governments where there are not strong disabled persons organisations. Their constructive dialogue with the CRPD committee is the first occasion on which they have found themselves questioned directly by knowledgeable and articulate persons with disabilities. Can I say that after one dialogue, an ambassador came up to me, I was chair at the time, and said, "Your committee members ask intelligent questions." I said, "We're not stupid." I said, half of them are lawyers, sociologists, and people who worked in the field. It's a great, life-changing experience for government officials. How am I going for time? Okay, 10 minutes or 5? No minutes. Okay, let me just speak about briefly what we've said about children with disabilities in our 10 concluding observations, and we've got 10 more coming up this year, next year, including Korea. We're very concerned about institutionalisation. We've seen it particularly in Spain, in other countries, far too many children in institutions. We're very, very concerned about a lack of inclusive education in all of the countries with which we've dialogued. We're also very concerned about violence, and particularly sexual violence against women and girls, and sometimes even boys with disabilities. And in our 9th session, last April, we held a half day of discussion and writing a general comment on problems of violence against children and girls and women with disabilities. We are concerned that in many countries, children really come at the bottom of the heap, and children with disabilities come way down at the bottom. I don't have time to talk to you about the high-level meeting of development and disability, but you can read the rest of my paper and recognise that we can see persons with disabilities and children with disabilities now being part of the post-15 development framework, which will help 80% of children with disabilities around the world. It's been a great honour to be here. Sorry I took up a lot of time with my braille reading. Bless you, take care, thank you very much.